On a quiet Sunday morning, 3 days after Jesus was crucified, Christian believers say the world's greatest miracle took place. Their Savior rose from the dead. But the biblical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, differ about the details of that morning. Mark says there were 3 women and an angel. Matthew reports 2 women and an angel. Luke says there were 3 women and 2 angels, while John says only Mary Magdalene was at the tomb along with 2 angels.
For people who have difficulty understanding that there can be discrepancies in the Gospels, I suggest an exercise of comparison. Simply take the 4 Gospels of the New Testament and list everything that each Gospel writer says happens when Jesus is raised from the dead, and then compare the lists and see if you can reconcile them. It's a very interesting exercise because the details are all different.
One of the lost texts, including the Gospel of Peter, which was discovered in 1886 in the tomb of an Egyptian monk, adds additional supernatural elements to the resurrection story.
There's another gospel account about Jesus' resurrection, and it's quite extraordinary. It's in a work that we call the Gospel of Peter.
The Gospel of Peter shares a remarkable story, lost more than 1,600 years ago. Christ is actually led out of his tomb by 2 enormous giants.
And the cross comes out of the tomb. What the cross was doing in the tomb, I don't know. But the cross follows Jesus out of the tomb.
The text says the voice of God booms from the heavens, asking Jesus if he preaches to the living and the dead. And the cross, floating above in the sky, replies and says, yes.
So you have the giant Jesus and the walking, talking cross. This is a terrific account. The idea is that the salvation of Jesus is effective not only for people who are alive, but for the saints who died before the death of Jesus. They too can now have salvation through the cross of Christ.
These kinds of fanciful details that strike us as silly, I think at one time impressed ancient hearers.
Other religious texts also address the story of Christ's resurrection. Around the year 313 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity. With the power of his newfound faith, he gave Christianity legal status. And he called for church leaders to unify the story of Jesus.
And so he essentially laid down the challenge to the church: get your act together. Figure out what the church is about. Have it be a single monolithic kind of unity. Find some creeds, find some scriptural books that can unite everybody, and let's go with it.
As the church unified its story of Jesus Christ, the alternative stories began to languish and disappear.
There were no pogroms, there were no book burnings. Churches simply wouldn't pay for these other Gospels to be copied. They had book budget for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they did not have book budget for the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of Philip. And that's why those Gospels fell into disuse, and that's why they disappeared.
Though lost to time, stories of this unknown Jesus may teach us something. There may be some insight found between the lines.
As an historian, I think that all of the texts that are to be found are to be looked at very carefully. They're all a part of the tapestry of history. They all make a contribution.
Here's the good news about all of those later traditions that are just pure myth. We don't need a supplement, a duplicate, or an amplification. We need to simply understand the original masterpiece.
But trying to understand that masterpiece, the Bible, appears to be what these authors attempted. By giving a face to Christ as a child, even a malicious one, they tried to take the biblical Gospels and fill in the blanks. by depicting an unconventional Christ. The Gnostics and other 2nd and 3rd century writers tried to connect with Jesus in their own way.
The fact is, to understand that there were a wide variety of people who are trying to attain to truth or truths, and that they all are people of goodwill who are writing texts and exploring possibilities, may allow us to be much more accepting of the fact that such texts are all to be read with interest and with value.
What, if anything, can be learned from these controversial stories? Perhaps simply that faith in Christianity will always spark passionate and diverse opinions.
If we recognize that from the very beginning Christianity was remarkably diverse, if nothing else, that should make us tolerant of diversity rather than intolerant.
Understanding the lessons gleaned from these mysterious texts doesn't come easy.
I think the average person has no other choice but to do some study, take some classes, read some good books, speak to people that know what they're talking about. But, you know, that's easy to say and hard to do.
Interpreting the stories of the lost texts may be a question of learning and faith. But one thing is clear. The writers who created these tales wanted to tell their own version of the Jesus story. Their narratives continue to amaze